You're listening to 2072, a Spotify original. This episode is called The Wild City, a short story written by Tjugosjuttiotvåtwenty, told by Edvin Ryding. The story takes place 50 years from now, in a reality that might be ours, according to contemporary science.
Mom is by the shore, barefoot. I watch her touching the water with her toes, crouching, looking into the water, touching the sand and stones, making little ripples on the calm surface. I think for her, serendipity was some kind of meaning. Not in any kind of fluffy, unexplained way, but clear and defined by yourself. One thing leads to another, and if only those connected things are mindfully tended to, serendipity will take you wherever you want to go. Sometimes I miss the sound of a roaring engine down the street. Or going to our grandparents in the countryside in the summer. Mom would fill up the tank while we went to get an ice cream inside. The smell of diesel, hot dogs, and dispenser coffee. The taste of ice crystals on an ice lolly that had been frozen, then melted, and frozen again. I'm too young to remember it in detail, but I remember the gravity in the faces of the grown-ups. The silent looks and nods and turning off the news to spare us kids. We had just come out of that first pandemic and all was almost normal again, except for the frightening, looming potential for a threatening world war that no one really understood the reason for. But I can still feel the time when everything changed. That time when it all stopped. When the gas stopped flowing. The cars were suddenly silent. When the city became the place to live and the outside the place to support the rest of us in surviving and thriving. Serendipity it is. My mother wants to visit the outside. Typical mom. Into the wild. It's her 80th birthday and the only thing she wants is the smell of pine and wet moss under her bare feet. Not the stuff planted in town. As wild as the rewilding corps wants to call it, it just isn't as wild as the wild itself. Or at least I think so. It's been so long since I was out there, and childhood memories tend to add to the adventure when really I don't remember much of that truly wild nature. In any case, Mom wants to get out there. It's as if what we mean by wild just isn't wild enough for her. My memories of wild nature look pretty much the same as what I live in today, even though it's now a wild city. What used to be endless lanes of cars and trucks and motorcycles and brick and concrete is now green. Crowds of people, and bears the smell of fresh air instead of exhaust fumes. Amazing how fast the world transformed. My childhood was filled with the smell of diesel and the sound of engines. Although I guess a lot of the new wave of urban planning was already trying to green the cities when I was a kid. I just didn't see it back then. A couple of generations later and those planted trees really did transform urban DNA all across the world. Amazing that I find myself waking up to the sound of the blackbird and the smell of grass. I can literally reach outside my kitchen window and pick my own herbs, and get homegrown veggies from the local farm down the block. The definition of living with nature, according to my mom. It's not just compatible with Mom's definition of wild. So, she wants to go. Like, not just visit, but rather camp out. Or even more aesthetically, I'm sure what she really wants is just a sleeping bag right under the stars. Never mind the bears, boar, and elk. She says all you have to do is just pee in a circle around your camp, and the wild animals won't come near. Yeah, well, I hate to disappoint her, but the fine to go free riding in nature is the size of my annual paycheck. Plus it's kind of criminal, so she really put the squeeze on me and my sister here. I love my mother deeply and forever, but I'm not ready to do a year of reforestation community service just so she can get a couple of days of childhood nostalgia in her lungs. But I realize I actually can't even imagine how that whole generation dealt with the separation. Basically overnight, the city locked down and the whole world had to leap straight into the environmental emergency plan. It must have been a terrible loss for those growing up with tree houses and river canoeing. An impossible choice to make. Or join the outside and devote your life, work, and time to the rewilding and protect what was left of Mother Nature. The world made a choice back then. To save the last bits of what had been and give nature a chance to regenerate and restore itself. Hopefully for future generations to enjoy in time. The way things are today, the wild city is where we live, and then there's the outside, strictly regulated and only inhabited by the caretakers of nature who basically make it possible for the rest of us to go about our lives instead of moving to another planet. And it's not like you can't go out there, you just have to follow the rules, that's all. Our mom really should have become a caretaker. A ranger living her life in and with nature, for nature. I like to fantasize about her out there. Talking to the trees, planting stuff in the spring and foraging in the summer. She tans easily and I imagine her skin would be like leather. Her hair bleached from the sun. And her eyes constantly on the ground. Searching for traces, stuff to restore or gather. Her ears always attentive to the sounds of nature. Animals, birds, the wind and the water. She would have spent her waking hours with the sunlight and lived in a house she built herself, all wood and glass. But I guess that wasn't realistic, what with raising 4 kids alone. As much as she lived for nature, her mission for all of us was to give us as much insight and information as possible. Read all the books, watch all the movies, listen to all the music. Introducing way too advanced books at too early an age and starting heated political debates before we were really intellectually mature enough to truly understand the topics. Watching her talk to her tomatoes on the balcony, I don't underestimate the cost and sacrifice she made. In fact, I suspect deep inside she might actually have believed that the kind of education a life in nature would give, the emotional and physical sense of connection and healing impact raw wild nature could give, would be superior to anything the modern world could offer at any given time. But since that wasn't possible, she was pragmatic. So, my siblings and I are planning a surprise trip to the outside. All the way back to where Mom used to live as a child. We all agreed it would have to be an organized stay, but I'm worried it'll make her sad to not get to ramble freely in the forest like when she was little. I remember one time, after Mom had dragged us out to the countryside for one of those barefoot encounters with Mother Earth, also part of her idea of educating our children. After one particularly remote camping trip, I called myself Nature Child. "Mom," I said, "I'm a real nature child." She looked so happy about this statement, choosing not to comment on the fact that I had actually grown up as a total city kid, with no more green havens than the nearby park and her endless windowsill planning project. Although I have to admit, those tomatoes tasted just the best. Whatever pride I would see reflected in her face after a violin concert or a ballet show, I never saw her prouder and happier as when watching us rambling in the forest, swimming freely in the ocean, knowing the name of every plant or creature by heart, or announcing ourselves as children of nature. That's when she was truly proud. As kids, we would go to the countryside quite often, but after the regulations we went more sporadically, maybe once a year, and always within the permitted areas. The hassle of bureaucracy and permits, not to mention all the tests, now make us hesitant to get out there. Almost like that first pandemic when I was 10, where we stayed in for months and had to get tested every second day. I remember I was so scared, then relieved after finally catching it and surviving. So silly to think of today, that we were so afraid of the virus, yet nobody really adjusted to the cold facts presented every day by scientists, echoed and amplified by the growing bunch of climate activists. I mean, they were just that. Activists. Not everyday people like the rest of us. Then. Now it's different. It's like the global population took a giant and fast educational step. And in the blink of an eye, one generation started caring about mental health, Mother Earth, and treating each other properly and equally. It was like those last couple of wars and the fight to end the pandemics just made it all so clear. How ridiculous to bomb each other while the real war should have been fought for our soul and the worldwide future possibility to feed everyone and live good lives. How utterly stupid to fight over whose religion was the most superior, or where to draw a country border. We were all in the same boat, and I think we kind of suddenly realized that the boat was sinking. Step by step, all those regulations were installed with the consent and support of billions, and looking back, it was like hitting the brakes on a very heavy freight train without making it derail. It just takes time to change the mindset of 7.9 billion people. It won't happen at once. They say that global changes will take at least a couple of generations, but here we are. We did change. Within the first half of my life, everything changed. They say that only 30% of a group needs to change in order for the rest to follow, or at least for change to spark. It's mad to think about the decades of decadent consumerism that preceded that moment, and those that followed. It's absurd that this information was available loud and clear, but rejected for generations. Undermined as fake news and hysteria by political leaders and ordinary people, even though it was the simplest equation in world history. If we used up all of the natural assets on the planet, then that planet will no longer be able to support human civilization.
If we use up all of the natural assets on the planet, then that planet will no longer be able to support human civilization.
Quite impressive to hear our mother's stories from a life lived through these monumental changes and see her still remain curious, interested, active. When we were young, me and my sister would be so scared of the day Mom would die. We would demand that she lived to be at least 100. To which she would laugh and respond, 100? Oh dear, I'm not sure I want to hang out that long. In that case, you'll have to carry me around like I did when you were babies. 100 seemed like an achievement back then, and remarkable that in my lifetime we've gone from an average age of like 82 to today where passing away after 100 is the norm. Looking at my mom, age really becomes just a number. If 40 was a time for midlife crisis and a second teenage period, 80 today seems like the third reckless phase in life. When I was a kid, ageism was a thing, and I would be so embarrassed whenever my mom would make a social media appearance. Now her generation rules it. However worried we might have been for our mother's future passing, that changed, and I now feel more concerned about being able to keep up with her. So we're going. We're all going. My 2 sisters, my 2 brothers, and me. Their kids, partners, dogs, and whatever we can fit into backpacks. Most of the kids are excited and looking forward to it, but my sister's little 7-year-old, a melancholic, heavy-hearted little philosopher of a boy, is terribly worried. "What if Grandma dies?" he said as a first response to my sister's proposal. She assured him that Grandma was nowhere near that state in life, but he got to her. And that evening she called me and repeated the concern. What if she died during the trip? After years on both sides of the therapy table, I don't own that kind of irrational emotion, and after hearing her concerns, I wrapped up the chain of thoughts rapidly with some quick math and statistics, along with pointing out our mother's impeccable health record, lifelong sobriety and athletic figure, and concluded that this was a close to ridiculous idea. Not that I, at any point, felt the nervousness of my sister. No, our mother was most certainly not going to die on this trip. It's just, I had this odd sense, almost a smell, a contour of something in a mental fog. Not unpleasant or uncomfortable, but a peculiar sense that this trip somehow had a fatal, cataclysmic, dire color somehow. Although not at all with the negative values of those specific adjectives. I think the adequate word would be anastrophic. So here we are. I can't remember how traveling was when I was a kid, but I grew up with the sense that everything was possible, that one could always get into a car and drive into the sunset, or jump on a plane and see the world. Passport, pesetas, and pickets, my father would say. As long as you had those, the world was one big party. It's not that it's complicated now, it's just a different routine. I'm impressed by the governmental effort and organizational ability to change the dysfunctional world order of my childhood into one system that everyone is now connected to. I believe the system was developed with that first pandemic when I was like 9 or 10, where global initiative was taken to form a coalition to create a unified digital database to easily get around safely, without the horrors of testing procedures and endless variations of more or less valid proof of health status forms. The coalition and its database was, of course, met with initial fear and skepticism and fueled conspiracy theorists all across the globe, but eventually it went on to become the standard for everyone, once it had been established that privacy and personal integrity was both protected and mandatory, like the old type of passports or entry visas. But it also came with costs, like you just can't disappear into that sunset anymore. Or at least it's very difficult, for good and for bad. So we're all checked, registered, approved, stamped, and signed off to be eligible for this 4-day trip to the outside. Yes, okay, so we might not have done everything by the book. Every grown-up must actually register individually, so Mom's husband might have cheated a little, but hey, he can't be the first to secretly open a partner's eyes during their sleep in order to face recognize them to register for a surprise trip, right? Anyway, that happened, and everything went according to plan. And oh, Mom's face when she arrived and saw us all standing there, realizing that we were going hiking in the woods after all. She just cried. And as tiring as emotional outbursts might be to me, I too couldn't help but notice tears streaming down my cheeks, assuring my kids I was just happy crying at the sight of my mother's joy. Every bureaucratic bump, every swearing at registry failures, packing hysteria, applying for leave, and so on and so on. Every bit of hustle organizing this trip faded immediately when we all saw how utterly happy she was seeing us all there, and even more so realizing the surprise plan. She beamed with happiness. The train has set off, and the initial rush when pulling out of the platform is now gone, and a comfortable, almost slumberous hissing sound surrounds us. while Mom tells our kids stories from their parents' childhood. How we all loved books and how Mom would make sounds to connect things to words. Like train, for example. She says, we would say clickety-clack for a train. Because the train back then rolled on tracks with joints or junctures that would make that very special sound. And so whenever your mom and dad would see a train, they would scream, clickety-clack, or choo-choo. How strange that those basics of our childhood just doesn't exist anymore. Right now I am truly happy that we went through with this plan, and I'm so much looking forward to showing the kids a bit of history. Not just family history, but human history. We've left our luggage in our cabins and only carried the necessities for a day excursion. Hiking boots, small backpacks with water and snacks, mosquito nets. We set off after breakfast. It's not a long hike for us grown-ups, but the kids might not make it all the way, so we start early to make the most of the day. Yesterday was spent at the base camp with protocol and safety briefings on how to behave out here. Or, more importantly, how not to behave. I can sense the kids are a bit astounded to be out here. Nature being so much more physically present than in the wild city. The silence. The orchestra of nature's own sounds. The birds, animals, the trees swaying in the mild summer breeze. Today it's time for the hike down memory lane. Mom is included in the plan and knows we're going all the way to our childhood lakeside camp. To Mom's delight, we managed to get a guide to take us all the way there. She seems thrilled, excited, and totally in harmony all at once. Like, well, as expected. Like this really is where she belongs. Mom knows these forests like her own pocket, but is polite enough to let the guide lead. We all enjoy seeing Mom in this natural environment of hers. She thrives. She always says nature heals, physically and mentally. And even though there was absolutely nothing wrong with Mom before, it's like the immediate presence of this primeval piece of nature is affecting her whole appearance. She looks more alive. It's almost like her skin tone changes. Her eyes become darker like the greens of the trees, like she slowly transcends into becoming one with her surroundings. The further we get into the deep green, the more absent Mom seems. Or maybe rather, the opposite. The deeper into the forest we go, the more in tune she seems. Not with us, but with the grass, the moss, the trees, and all the plants and animals she encounters. Our guide seems to sense the change of energy and falls silent to make space for Mom's endless comments. Look there, sorrel. Bitter, but very good for your immune system, kids. Oh, and there's whey bread. We used that instead of plasters when I was a kid. The kids are variously interested, and by lunchtime, half of them have walked back with the assistant guide and my youngest sister. We get to the lake after lunch, and the sun is out. It's a serene spot. Something resonates inside me. I know I've been here before. When I was little, but the pictures in my head are most probably copies of photos Mom has showed me. The beauty, calm, and air of the spot is almost moving and leaves no one unaffected. We, only grown-ups and teenagers still left now, sit along with the guide and watch the glittering water. The deep green of the forest. The black lake. The blue sky. My sister slumbers. Mom is by the shore, barefoot. I watch her touching the water with her toes, crouching, looking into the water, touching the sand and stones, making little ripples on the calm surface. There's a complete harmony over it all. Serenity. It's the luck you earn, the gifts you get, if you never focus on getting them, she would say. The good that will come to the good. I think for her, serendipity was some kind of meaning. Not in any kind of fluffy, unexplained way, but clear and defined by yourself. One thing leads to another, and if only those connected things are mindfully tended to, serendipity will take you wherever you want to go. Serendipity it is. Because all of a sudden, she's gone. I don't know if I ever saw her jump into the water or walk away from the camp. None of us did. No matter how many times we discuss, go over those last hours, minutes, seconds, it remains as one collective glitch in the system. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody saw her disappear. It was like she fused, merged, blended into, or just finally united with that circle of life she had longed to close. Back with the beginning of creation. Gone she was. Into the wild.